Right. Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending where you're joining us from. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining today's webinar, How to Forecast Demand in Uncertain Times. My name's Franklin Ray, and I'll be the moderator today. And we'll begin this webinar shortly, but let me just first go over a few logistics. This webinar presentation will run about 45 minutes, and we'll save that period at the end for Q&A. During the webinar, you can submit questions using the Q&A function on screen at any time. So submit your questions as they come to you. I'll be monitoring these questions throughout the webinar, and when we get to the end, we'll have a list compiled for the Q&A at the end of the presentations, and we'll also take questions submitted during the Q&A session itself. We'll do our best to address as many of the questions we get as possible, and if we don't get to your question, you'll receive a follow-up email at the conclusion of the webinar, providing you an answer for that. We're also going to be recording this webinar, and at the end, you'll receive an email link to the video sometime within the next week once we get it available. We're also going to post this webinar to both the Forecast Pro website and the Forecast Pro YouTube channel, where we also have an archive of all the past webinars. They're free. They're a great way to catch up on any past webinars you may have missed. And with that said, now I'm going to turn things over to our presenter, James Barry, to introduce himself and kick off today's webinar, How to Forecast Demand in Uncertain Times.
Thank you, Franklin. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. Hopefully, we're going to be able to cover a lot of useful topics that are pretty relevant to just about any company these days who has to deal with forecasting. So in terms of our agenda today, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about current issues that companies are facing, these common problems that probably many of you are facing, either in some regards or all of these different problems that we're facing. We're going to talk about the different kinds of challenges that people have dealt with in the past year and that they will continue to deal with going forward. Then what we'll do is we'll look at some examples of these different problems, as well as some solutions that companies are trying. So we have a few example companies here that have been facing common problems, and we'll talk about how they address those issues. And we'll look at some sample data that they've provided that we can use and see how that all works. And then finally, what we'll do is we'll wrap up basically some of our findings of what we have today. As Franklin mentioned throughout this webinar, if you do have any questions as this comes up, please use the chat functionality. You'll be able to track your questions there, and then we'll save the last 15 minutes to do a Q&A session as well. Okay. So what we're going to start with are some of the current issues that many of you are facing. So given the current environment, since the pandemic in 2020, and that was kind of behind us, in the last 12 to 18 months, there are these common issues that people are facing with their data. First would be a disruption in shipping, because of, while this made headlines last summer, this is still something that many companies are still facing, which is that we have these kind of issues and longer lead times to get our raw materials if we're in manufacturing, or to get our finished goods if we manufacture overseas. So to get all of this, basically materials or goods to us has been stretched out. And of course, this has led to stockouts, and this of course leads to even longer term back orders. And it becomes this kind of vicious cycle of we stock out, which causes back orders. We try to fill our back orders, which then depletes our safety stock. We stock out again, and we get into this kind of bullwhip effect of always in this kind of playing catch up cycle, which is something that a lot of folks are facing. So when we get into these kinds of situations, there's kind of a question of how do we want to deal with this? How do we want to deal with this? How do we try to get over how do we get over this kind of problem of generating these stockouts, which lead to back orders, which eat up our safety stock? How do we get out of this vicious cycle? Another common issue that folks have been seeing is that there's actually a change in their patterns since 2020, and so their actual demand patterns that they were seeing prior to the pandemic might no longer be valid. We have an example of this that we'll look at with a sporting goods company where basically their entire business has changed significantly, and there is a quote new normal that we need to deal with. And still, there's an ongoing staffing issue, which has become a real big problem for a lot of folks, where either it's, if you're in manufacturing, finding folks there, as well as sales people, if we're trying to sell, if we're trying to do more marketing, that's becoming an issue as well. And so these are real issues that have been facing everybody. And in fact, we surveyed our Forecast Pro users a couple months ago, and we tried to ask them, what are some of their common issues? And these are the ones they said. And in terms of percentages, the biggest that we saw, obviously, folks could select more than one issue. Obviously, it'd be nice if you only had one of these issues, but a lot of folks have multiples of these issues. And this increased lead time is by far the most common that we're seeing, which of course also equals the stockouts and back orders. Over 80% are dealing with all of these problems. And these problems have been persistent for the last 12 to 18 months. And so they've been having to deal with this. Another issue that we're seeing is large customer orders. And we have an example of this in today's webinar that we're going to take a look at. One of the things that they're finding is that some of your key customers have started, especially if you're dealing with big box retailers or online retailers, places like Walmart or Amazon or Home Depot here in the US, if you're dealing with these kinds of huge companies, they are starting to place extremely large orders, knowing that you may not be able to fill them, but just to try to game their system and get ahead in their place. So they're, large customers, they're placing these huge increases in demand, 10, 20 times what they would normally order, just with the idea that they'll take all of your stock that you have and then continue to do that. So we have that kind of problem. We saw that half of our customers are still facing staffing issues, which is very common. We hear that problem all the time. There's both turnover in planning, but also, just unfulfilled roles that need to be filled, and people are sort of scrambling to fill them. And then just a few folks actually have a problem of excess inventory, although that has been, depending upon if you're in a retail environment, a big problem as well, which is that as we came out, especially towards the end of 2022, basically we were trying to get over these stockouts and back orders by placing huge orders with our suppliers, which has led to excess inventory. In fact, the reason we had this on here, we were wondering if this has started to creep in, and we actually expect this to probably creep up a little bit into 2023, where people try to get out of this back order, stock out sort of cycle by placing huge orders with their suppliers, which could potentially, if they mistime it, lead to an excess in inventory. And this is something that we're trying to monitor going forward with some of our customers to see how all this works. Now, the other thing that we asked our customers is, how do we feel about 2023? So we're still here in January of 2023. We've made it out of 2022. We want to know how people are feeling. And one of the things that we wanted to ask them is, do we expect your demand pattern to start settling down? This kind of, the last 12 to 18 months have been crazy. Do we think it's going to start settling down in 2023? And basically, almost 2/3 of our customers said, yes, we do think that this is going to start settling down, and 27% said no, and 10% said they didn't know. What's interesting about this is we ran this exact survey in September of 2020. As the peak, as the height of the lockdowns and everything started to ease somewhat, we asked everybody in 2020, do you expect your business to settle down in 2021? And basically the vast majority, almost 75%, said yes back then. So we can take this with a grain of salt. Everybody thought 2021 was going to be the smooth sailing, and it didn't seem to work out that way, nor did 2022. Now everybody, majority of our customers think 2023, that's going to be when it comes down, and we certainly hope that's the case. But given the last few years, there's a question of whether this really will happen or not. So what I want to do is I want to actually jump into a few examples. We have 3 different examples with some of our customers that deal with some of these common issues that we've just talked about. And I want to give them as kind of a sort of a good, they're kind of a good subset of the kinds of problems that a vast majority of you are facing. So let's jump into these. We're going to start with our medical equipment company, okay? So what they were doing is they were having the common issue of a longer lead time. Okay, so they were a US-based company, and they had 2 manufacturing plants here in the United States, and the vast majority of their products were coming from Southeast Asia, and they were being shipped, globally to get all of this information. So their raw materials and their parts were coming from Southeast Asia, and their lead times extended from 30 days out to 120 days. And this was a real problem, that they just simply were not getting the raw material and their key components that they needed to put this together. And of course, this led to a whole bunch of issues where we have large spikes in our recent history, where we basically stock out. So we have zero demand. And what happens when you stock out and you build up these back orders, what you try to do is you just place huge orders with your suppliers, get all that inventory in, and then send it all out at once. And so we basically use up all the inventory we have, we send it out as we get it, and then we stock out again, which of course leads to these back orders. And this is really a classic example of this bullwhip effect. And we are seeing this, obviously it's here in this medical equipment company, but we're seeing this just across the board with lots and lots of our different customers that we're seeing this. One of the other things that this is leading to is a decline in forecast accuracy. Okay, so obviously now, there is this big question of how we want to actually forecast something like this when we have these problems. Do we want to say, look, we expect this to continue at least for the next 6 months, so we start forecasting and predicting them that way, that we know, we just had a major shipment and we're going to be out of stock for the next 2 months. Should I actually be making that into my expected demand going forward, into my forecast? Or should I just continue to forecast what I think my expected demand is, knowing we're not going to be able to meet that? And that's actually the decision most customers have taken, is that they simply are going to continue to forecast, what their expected demand is. One of the other things that folks have been doing because of this decline in accuracy is, instead of, most of our customers are using monthly historical data. Instead of looking at their forecast accuracy by month, they're starting to look at forecast accuracy by quarter. And so, we're basically saying, look, I'm on a month by month basis, we're not going to get this right, but maybe on a quarterly basis, we can maybe get our numbers, the total for the quarter, to be accurate. And so how this looks in a historical sense is we have our data, that's moving along, and then all of a sudden we stock out, which of course leads to a slight mild recovery as we just burn through whatever inventory we have. We try to fill our back orders with this huge order out of here, which of course leads to another stock out, which leads to another mild recovery, which leads to another back order fill, which will continue this cycle, and it will perpetuate this cycle. And so we need to figure out, if I'm seeing this kind of information in my data, how do I want to handle this? And what do I want to do going forward with this? So we're going to go look at an example of this data in Forecast Pro. So here's some of the sample data that we have from this medical company. You can see, and this will be true for a lot of the data that we see, there's this kind of dip in the spring of 2020. There's kind of a recovery. And then in the recent few months, we're starting to see these kinds of spikes. We see it here with this data. We can see it here where it's actually much more pronounced, where it's been happening for several months. We can see it here where it just started. There was a huge order that basically took out all of our supply. We were able to get some back in stock, but we've stocked out again. And these are causing real issues with our forecasts. If we don't handle these in any way, we're going to sort of see the forecasts are going to be, this one's a flat line, and this one's kind of all over the place, continuing these spikes, but not nearly at the levels that we would need them to be. So to handle something like this in Forecast Pro, the most common way of dealing with this would be through our events. So if I come up here to my forecasting tab, I'm going to go over to my event modeler. And what I need to do is I need to create these event schedules to mark what happened. And I can see here, when I click on one of these spikes in the graph, I have set up in this project a few different codes that could explain what happened, which is that we had a stock out, we had a makeup order, we had a back order, or we had some supply issues. So we have certain codes explaining what happened. So here we can see in this dip, this was obviously a stock out month. I can have something like that. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select all of the stock out months, so I can have them all over here and add them all as stock out. So you can see we stocked out in February and in April and in May and in August and September and November. And then what we can do is we can come over here and grab these spikes as well. and basically say that these were our makeup orders. We had to do our makeup orders on these months because that's what was happening over here. And I can go ahead and commit this. And when I remove these spikes from the data, you'll see the data starts normalizing quite a bit. Okay. Now there are some other things that could have happened. We could say that this was this one and this one here were our these were some supply issues that we had over here, so we can commit that and really normalize this a bit more. But now we are faced with, okay, well now I have now we have our data down here. What I want to do is, do I want to continue forecasting as this flat line, or do I want to try to build these spikes into the future? Now, what most people are deciding to do is they are deciding to continue on with their forecast as if these spikes are not going to happen. Okay, so we're not going to continue these in the future. That's what this company did. And so they would have to come over here, and they again, this one's affected in a different way, but the same kinds of things are happening. So we can come over here. We actually need to add a special order because that's what that one was. So we'll go ahead and add that one because that's what this was. This was a big giant special order, which of course led to these months of stocking out. We had our makeup order and our makeup order over here. And our data will then resume, as opposed to being flat, to actually getting back to the seasonality that we're seeing. And we would do this across the board for all of our different items, is we'd have to come in and start marking these different events and basically saying, hey, all of these interruptions have happened in the past, but we don't expect them to continue into the future. Here is our expected demand. If we could meet this demand, this is what we would want it to be. And that's exactly what this medical company did. For their solutions, they did a couple of things here. First of all, they continued to forecast their expected demand regardless of stockouts. They basically said, look, we expect to continue to have supply issues for the first 2 quarters of 2023, but their goal is to eliminate these back orders by the second half of 2023. And until they have that, they're going to continue forecasting expected demand, and they're going to basically treat their forecast as something separate that they're going to have to just handle outside of their system. They were doing it in their ERP system to try to figure this out. Now, one of the other things that they were able to do is they switched their data. Instead of date ordered, and this is another common thing that has come up quite a bit, instead of focusing on the date an order comes in, they have started switching to a date to promise. Now, a lot of planning systems have this option available to them where they can look at this date to promise kind of thing. So, a customer places an order today, but we're stocked out. We already have back orders. And so instead of basically promising the customer that we're going to get it today, they say, look, we're not going to have it for 60 days. You'll most likely get this at the end of March. And a lot of folks have really switched over to this system. And so now when they load their historical demand data in, instead of its date to order, it's date to promise, which is trying to eliminate some of the spikiness in the data by coming over here and saying, it's not when a customer places an order, it's when we're going to promise them this order. And this has led to some smoothing out of the data. Now, obviously, this can play some real issues with, is this actually true demand? Because if a customer placed an order today, they would expect it today and they would take it today. But it does help them get around all of this spikiness in their data. It also helps get around these back order system problems. And so if you ever want to try to get out of this back order problem, I need to start saying, here's when we promise all of these things. And hopefully, if we have orders far enough out and we have enough of a lead time, we can place more accurate orders on the longer term so that we can eliminate these back orders, knowing that here's our expected demand going forward. I know we already have this high demand for the next, I know I have this high demand for the next few months, and so I'm going to go ahead and try to figure that out as well. So this company, again, continued to do expected demand. It did not, build in these stock out spikes into their future. Instead, they just said, here's what our expected demand is going to be. We're going to treat these back orders separately outside of Forecast Pro. They have this kind of expectation that for the first 2 quarters this year that they're going to keep doing it, but their hope is to eliminate in the second half. And they've switched over to this date to promise. So these are some of the key solutions that this company found when it came to dealing with these kinds of large supply shocks that they were coming across. Okay. Now, on the other hand, we have another company, which is our toy company, and they had similar problems, but it was kind of it kind of presented itself in a different format. So in the toy company, they were dealing with very large retailers. In their case, they were dealing with Amazon and Walmart. And in the last year or so, these companies have sort of figured out that if they push their suppliers, in this case, this toy company, with these gigantic orders that they know they can't fill, it basically puts them to the front of the line and allows them to take all of the inventory that that company has. And what ends up happening is they will tend to say, okay, well, I'm usually ordering, about 1,000 a month. I'm going to place an order for 5,000 this month, knowing that this company simply can't meet that demand. And what they will do is they will order 5,000, take all that you have, and then cancel that order. And then the next month, they will place another order for 5,000 units, take whatever you have, cancel that order, and then do it again until they finally get enough of their supply that they actually need. Now, a lot of companies and a lot of ERP systems that don't track cancellations, they just track orders. So when people pull their data into your forecasting system, you tend to just pull all orders and you don't really track cancellations. And we see this all the time. What this ends up looking like is that you have one large order placed multiple times, but in your history, it looks like you have multiple months of huge demand, which really throws off the forecast. And then, of course, this is followed by the inevitable stockout that happens afterwards. So this is something we're seeing more and more in the data. Whereas the medical company would get orders were pretty consistent, they were just stocking out. And so they're doing this. When some of these companies, especially when you're dealing with these big box retailers or online forums like Amazon, they are finding that they are placing these huge orders multiple times in a row and canceling them, just basically saying, look, I wanted 5,000, you delivered 2,000, which is all you had. They canceled the 5,000 and ordered 5,000 again the next month and then the next month until they got all that they needed. And so in our historical data, we're starting to see these big multi-month pieces because a lot of folks don't have the ability to track returns or canceled orders and things like that. And so it basically comes in their historical state as, look, we're basically pulling all of our orders. We had a lot of huge orders from our major customers, but this was causing problems. And so again, we can take a look at this data over here. So here's the company, and you start seeing a lot of data like this, where there's multi-months of big orders, they stock out, then they place, again, multi-months of big orders. And we're starting to see these kinds of plateaus of orders that are coming in here, and it's causing a lot of problems, this kind of multi-month plateau order situation. Now, once again, what we would want to do is we want to handle these with events. But what's different about this company is that they actually went with the other strategy, which is that they wanted to continue knowing that this is going to happen again in the future. So again, what they did is they created events. So I have these same SKUs down here, but where I've actually put the events in. And so they actually come in and said, yeah, these were events, we've stocked out, we had these supply issues, and then we had these huge orders come in. But we know the customer is going to keep doing this in the next couple of quarters. So we are going to plan on them placing these giant orders so that we can go to our suppliers and try to get enough of a safety stock and inventory built up out of this, because our expected demand is that this is going to continue. When we look at some of these, we expect this to continue. We expect these really large orders to keep happening in the future. And we expect that there will be stockouts leading up to these. So they have actually decided to go the other direction. Not everybody has to say, hey, you know what, we're just going to keep going and we're going to plan on us settling down. Some companies are saying, no, you know what, realistically, for the next year, we're going to keep having these problems. Our customers, places like Amazon and Walmart, they're going to keep doing this to us. And the only way for us to get out of this cycle is to forecast these as we know they're coming in and to try to build up enough of an inventory and enough of a safety stock in order to carry this, okay? And that's what the toy company did. They basically said, knowing that they're going to continue, they're going to keep putting them in here. And one of the ways that they dealt with this is by putting in a much larger safety stock. Now, this has a lot of cost associated with it. By carrying a higher safety stock, what you end up with is obviously you risk having excess supply. So going back to our original survey, when we asked folks, do you have an excess supply of inventory? Only 5% of our customers said yes. But we actually expect that to increase now in 2023 because we're seeing more and more companies like this that are just jacking up their safety stock with expectations of these giant orders. And they're placing a bet that these orders will continue in this way. And the only way to get out of this is to build up a huge inventory. And this has lots of costs. They have holding costs. They have, basically their capital is tied up in all of this excess inventory. And if they have too much, they're going to have to discount it to push it off. But not everybody is sort of going along saying, hey, things are going to return to normal. These spikes are going to end, and let's just keep planning on that. Other companies say, no, this is going to continue. What we're going to do is we're going to plan on it to continue, and we're going to build up a huge safety stock based off of that so that we can try to get out of this vicious cycle of stockouts and overbuilding. And so this is a different solution to the same kind of problem, that we have these big spikes in our data and we need to handle it. Okay. Now, the third company that I would like to discuss is a sporting goods company. And what they've had happen is they've actually established a new normal. Okay. So when COVID hit, obviously they actually had a very beneficial effect off of this. They were selling sporting goods at home. People were stuck at home. They were doing more, especially things like golf and basketball, especially, when school returned in, 2021 or at the end of 2020 or into 2021, outdoor sports like soccer and tennis, these really took off like crazy, and their entire business grew. And so during their 2020, they had an unbelievable kind of growth. It wasn't, a lot of folks have kind of negative impacts from the lockdowns, but some companies really benefited from it. And this company did as well. But what then happened is that actually their entire business demand shifted. It changed. Post-pandemic, all of a sudden, things were very different. A good example that they gave me was that, golfing, golf season sort of extended into the fall, which they never really used to have. When they were selling golf equipment, basically it was a spring and summer kind of thing, especially, where I am here in the Northeast, but it really extended into the fall. People would just enjoy playing it. There was a larger group of folks, and they were just selling more in the fall, which they just never did. And so their entire business pattern shifted because of that. And so what you would see in their historical data is they had one pattern pre-COVID, then there was the pandemic year, and then a post-pandemic happened here. This was obviously for their summer stuff, things that used to move over, but their golf ones that they were telling me about, it actually went from spring, summer to now being spring, summer, and fall. And so their business completely changed. And so if we look at this, if we go over and take a look at their data, what we have found ourselves in is, you can see, basically here's their 2020 where they have this big spike. It's across all of their different products. You can sort of see that happening. There's kind of a big difference. And then their pattern going forward shifts. Here for this item, for example, it used to peak in November, and now it peaks in July. It has shifted from the end of the year, from the fall and the winter, into the summer. And this item, you can see, used to peak here in February. It's still, and now it has a February and August peak. So there's two peaks in it. And this is really throwing off Forecast Pro. And so when we look at this type of data, we can see that the model doesn't know what to do, because we have 2 years at one pattern, we have 1 year that's very anomalous, and then we have 2 more years at another pattern. And while the models do weight the more recent data more heavily, one of the things that you have to consider is, do I want to actually use this data pre-pandemic anymore? Now, we at Forecast Pro, and those of you who have spoken to us in the past will probably know this, is, we are always of the belief that more data is better, and that's generally the case. However, we are at a very unique point. We are now in 2023, which means we have closed out both 2021 and 2022, which are post-pandemic years. We have 2 complete post-pandemic years. And what this has actually allowed us to do is, we now have enough data post-pandemic that we could consider chopping off the data pre-pandemic and not using it. In fact, it's interesting, in preparing for this webinar today, just this past week, I talked, even just completely independent of this, of two customers as I was doing training who were actually asking exactly this, where they were saying, look, our 2020 and earlier data just isn't really valid anymore. Should we actually consider just using 2021 and 2022? And we have actually reached the point that that actually might be appropriate for either some of your data or all of your data, that we might only want to use starting in January of 2021 going forward, because we now have the 2 complete years. That's kind of the magic number where we can start using complex models, but I might want to ignore this before. And I've actually found myself in a situation like this previously. I've been with the company now 20 years. This is my 20th year. And this actually did happen one time before, which is in 2010. So post financial crisis in 2008, I used to have this exact same conversation with folks. They were basically like, look, 2006, 2007, my business was growing like a rocket ship, and that's not going to happen anymore. And in 2008, my business collapsed in a way that that's not going to happen anymore. And so 2009 and 2010, this has been my new normal. And so when I'm sitting here at the end of 2010, moving into 2011, I was having this exact same conversation with folks where basically there was a large global event that completely changed our business. And there really is no benefit to having this data prior to that event because it simply doesn't represent where our business is going into the future. And so we are at a great time right now because we have crossed that threshold. We now have 2 complete years and our data will continue to grow post-pandemic. And so we can clip our data off if we want to. Now, there are multiple ways to do this. I don't know why this thing is, sorry, the little noise is over here. So one of the things that I could do it on an item by item basis. So here in Forecast Pro, you can see we have our start dates option over here, and I could do this one at a time and say, you know what, I want this history to start in, we'll say July of 2020. And I can go ahead and say, okay. And what you will see is it will gray out all of this historical data and it won't use it, and it will just use the data going forward. So I can set starting points for particular items, or alternatively, one of the things that I could do is I can actually come over here to the operations tab and change the global period. And so what I could do is I could actually say, you know what, I want all of our data to start on January of 2021. And so I'm going to ignore this one and I'm going to recalculate. And now all of my items will only use 2021 and 2022's data to generate my forecast going forward. And you can start seeing this makes a lot more sense. Now, this pattern, which has established itself in the last 2 years, is being forecast going forward. The same thing over here, we can sort of see our declining trend, but our new seasonal pattern has been established over here. So we are actually at a crucial time for this. It's something that it's kind of a perfect timing for this webinar because we now have data for 2 complete years that are post-pandemic. And 2 years is kind of the magic number. When we did a webinar at the end of 2020, basically saying, how do we deal with the pandemic? Very similar to what we were talking about here. And there was kind of this, do you think that what has happened is done and you've started to establish a new normal, or do you think it's going to continue to keep happening? But now we've been so far removed from that we have been able to build a new data set. I have 2021 and 2022. These are indicative of what I'm going to happen. Now, of course, if I have all these supply chain issues and all these things, that's still going to be a problem that I'll have to deal with. But pre-pandemic, my business was completely different. And so I want to come in here and I want to basically change this. One of the things, they didn't have this, we didn't have an example, they didn't give this to us, but their business had been growing like crazy in 2020 and in 2021, and 2022 it kind of leveled off. And of course, Forecast Pro was having a tendency of continuing that trend upward, and they think they've leveled off. So for 2023, they also removed trends because they think that that kind of growth rate that they were experiencing wasn't going to come in there. Okay. So again, these three examples from these three different companies are common problems that people have been facing. And so what we want to talk about is, what are the problems people are facing, and more importantly, what are kind of the solutions? Okay, so we know we have this problem with stockouts and back orders and longer lead times. And we know that within the tool, we can use events to mark these in the history as saying, look, something special has been happening. But what we need to do is we need to decide as a company and as a business, hey, while we have these kinds of decisions to make, do we want to continue those into the future because we know they're going to keep happening? Or do we want to continue to forecast what we expect demand to be without these kinds of issues? And that's a really critical choice that as a company you need to make. As we saw, the medical company, they continued on as if this was not going to happen. What is my true demand going to be? Whereas the toy company said, no, this is just a reality of our life. We're going to expect this going forward. And so you have to make those decisions. There's also this question of, are we getting these large multiple orders? Folks who deal with big box retailers or online websites, they are dealing with this kind of problem. And so we need to figure out, do we expect these multi-period giant orders to keep happening? Or do we think that that was just kind of a remnant from the pandemic as well? There's also this question of, do I want to shorten my history? We have reached that point that we now have enough data post-pandemic that we may want to just not include the data that, from, halfway through 2020 and prior. We might just not want to use that anymore. We have now gotten far enough away from that we might want to consider ignoring that data prior to it, which is not something that we at Forecast Pro usually recommend to folks, but we are in a very unique situation. And this is one of those times where that might actually be a good idea. And then finally, another big common thing that we are seeing with folks is this shifting of order date to promise. A lot of ERP systems or planning systems or inventory systems can do this. Most folks never took advantage of it, but we are seeing this more and more, which is this kind of, look, the only way we're going to get out of this vicious cycle of stockouts and back orders is to basically start promising longer, basically making our customers wait longer for their products, that they can't just get it instantly. And that setting expectations, filling that, having a better, I will know for the next few months what my promised inventory is going to be. So I have a better sense of handling how much I need to be ordering and or manufacturing going forward so that I can get out of this kind of stock out back order system and start pulling that down. So these are really important decisions to make. Okay. So again, the purpose of this webinar was to just kind of bring to light these kinds of problems. We are seeing just about every company face one or more of these problems. And, I get data all the time. I work with multiple customers every week. We work with them, and you just see all of these problems in their data. And everybody has different solutions to them, but these common ones that we highlighted here are some of the common solutions that we're seeing people employ in order to get around these issues that everybody is facing. Okay. So with that said, I just have a few closing housekeeping things, and then we will get to folks' questions. So as Franklin mentioned in the intro, we recorded this webinar. We also live stream it. So it will be posted to both Forecast Pro as well as our YouTube channel. When it is posted, everybody here on this meeting will receive an email saying when it goes live. So you'll be able to get that. We will also post these slides. So you'll be able to see the slides that I put together here. That will be available on our website as well. So keep an eye out for there. Also, as Franklin mentioned, if you go to our YouTube channel, you will see not just this webinar, but any of the past webinars. We run these once a quarter. We've been running them for many, many years. So there's a great archive of previous webinars up there. They are free. Please feel free to browse that and see how that works. And speaking of webinars, our next one will be in April. It will be run by my boss, Eric Stellwagen, which is basically looking at additional inputs to improve forecast accuracy. So this will look at things like multivariate forecasting, but also outside external data, adjustments, other information beyond just using your history to hopefully help make better forecasts. So this will be on April 13th. If you go to our website, forecastpro.com/events, you can sign up now for that. You will also get when we send out the videos, there will also be a link to sign up then. So you will have a chance to sign up at that point today. And again, we used Forecast Pro software today. You saw doing some of the events as well as shifting some of the dates around and things like that. If you would like more information about Forecast Pro, please reach out, either go to our website. You can get a free trial on our website. You can also just scan this QR link here on your screen. If you have your phone open right now, it'll take you to the page. We also do live demos. So if you don't have Forecast Pro and would like to see Forecast Pro in action with your data, we are happy to do that as well. We have folks who'd be able to do that for you there. Okay, so with that said, what we're going to do is we're going to turn it over to questions. As we mentioned, there's sort of the QA and the chat functionality here in the Zoom meeting. Franklin has been monitoring that. We will try to answer a couple of your questions now. If we don't get to your question, again, don't worry. We will follow up with emails if we don't get to it. Okay, so please don't try to get to as many as we can. We'll try to go through that, but please now, if you would like to go to the chat or to the Q&A part of the box, please go to now, and Franklin will do that. So Franklin, do we have some questions from the audience today?
Yeah, we sure do. So thanks for the presentation. And I just want to emphasize to everyone again, this will be recorded. And if you're interested in Forecast Pro, please feel free to follow up with us. As James said, there are a couple different ways you can do that. As far as getting to questions, we do have a few of them. And I guess we can start with why for the skew, specifically skew 2 on your example, are there a lot of ups and downs in the history, but the forecast itself is a flat line?
Okay, that's a good question. So if we go to probably this one, okay? So I would imagine it was this one. A lot of them were flat lines before, and that is because one of the ways you can see this is if we actually turn the graph and we change it from a time series to a year-over-year chart, so we can actually look for the patterns in the history. So when we look at this data, you can see the blue line. This is last year's history, and then the orange line is the year before. So basically the blue line is 2022, the orange line is 2021. And when the models are trying to build a forecast, they are looking for patterns that repeat themselves in your historical data. And the issue you will see is that these giant orders basically skewed the historical data such that there is no pattern. So here, when we weren't being affected by this in January, February, March, the year over year is pretty consistent. From January to February, both years went up. To March, it was up. April, it went down. But then, because of these large orders, they started moving in completely opposite directions. Last year, there was a small order in May where we basically stocked out in April and May of 2021. And then in 2021, in July and August, we had these giant orders that the customer placed, which we did not get again in 2022. Instead, those orders came in September, October, November, which were really down months in 2021. And then obviously in December, we stocked out in 2022, whereas we had a large order coming in 2021. So if you look at this, there is no pattern year over year. And so the program just takes some sort of average. And that's actually critical because this is one of the problems with these spikes. Not only are these spikes causing headaches from a supply chain perspective, they are also causing a headache in the forecasting side because they are skewing the data in such a way that the program simply cannot find another pattern because they're so dramatic. Now, where there's only one of these or so, and you have lots of data, the seasonal pattern may still be present. It'll just be kind of skewed a little bit during those periods. But for something like this, where you have a short amount of history and the year over year is just so radically different, the program simply has to take an average. Whereas when I come over here and actually put the event on it, I can actually tell it, hey, you know what? We're going to have these spikes again, but it's going to be in these 2 months. And we're going to stock out in this month and in this month. And so we can actually start figuring out the pattern for the other months as well. And that's why the events play such a huge role. But one of the best ways to see it, again, is to switch here in the graph from a time series, where it's kind of hard because you see, again, our technical term is that the line wiggles. Look, my history wiggles. Why doesn't the forecast wiggle? It must be broken. But if we look at a year-over-year graph, you'll see that the issue really comes down to the fact that there is no pattern in the data, because the pattern has been so distorted by these giant spikes. And thus the program you'll see a lot of these averages, and this is a lot of the real problems. This is what they're trying to solve with these events. So excellent question, but that's why you're seeing something like that. Okay.
Thanks. All right, we have another one. The question is, are you forecasting orders or shipments specifically in your medical example? It seems that the stockout is a shipment rather than an order issue. Shouldn't the issue be how are the orders affected by the stockout?
Okay, excellent question. And this definitely is an important distinction. These data sets are from different companies, and different companies do different things. And so you are correct. There is a supply issue and there is a demand issue. And the stockouts, basically, if you're looking at shipments versus orders versus this, also you could do production data as well. These are looking at shipments. So the medical company was doing shipments, and shipments has the benefit of in normal times kind of being more stable, in the sense that a customer places an order for 100,000 units, but look, I can only make 25,000 a month, and so my shipments will just be, I'm just going to ship that 25,000 per month over the next 4 months, which is the maximum that I can produce, and my data stays pretty consistent. So shipments, when folks use them, can be more stable, and it can be easier to forecast. Now, there is a question of if shipments truly represent demand. Now, some companies have basically no lead time, or a day or two lead time, and so when an order comes in, it gets shipped out within a day or two. Those are pretty comparable to each other. But shipments can be, as I say, smoother, which is that, in my example where we only shipped 25,000 a month, the true demand was 100,000. The customer would have taken 100,000 if he had it. You just couldn't make that much, so we just shipped it out. The other problem with looking at shipments is that when you stock out, it will basically zero out. When people are looking at orders, you don't see a lot of months where there are no orders, because customers continue to order things, even if we have a back order and we stock out. And so those tend to be treated differently. So the good thing about an order or a sale, depending upon what your system calls it, is that when a customer places an order, your expectation is that the customer wants it at that point. And so orders kind of represent demand, but that's not always true. There are some industries that's not even close to being true. For example, last year I worked with a commercial carpet manufacturer. When people place orders for carpets, when we start building commercial buildings, they place order for all their materials all at once, but they don't actually spec their carpets, which is really one of the last things they install, for several months after that. And so their date to promise is, they're placing an order today, but they don't expect it today. They're expecting it further down the road. So for most industries, orders or sales are what most people use, because they expect it to more represent true demand. But of course, that can get you into the same problem that the toy company had, which is we are using actual orders. That's what they are doing, which is why you have these spikes multiple months. Whereas if they just did shipments, they would have actually been able to say, look, we didn't ship that much. We only shipped this much and this much. And they would have been able to get around that in some ways. But again, they have trade-offs. And so this is always a debate at most companies. Now, this debate is usually solved at most companies because their planning system, or wherever they're getting their data, only tracks one of these. They either track orders or they track shipments. They don't track both. There's also, some people track production. If we're a manufacturing company, we're going to actually forecast our production lines. That's a completely different set of data as well. So there are pluses and minuses to what you use. Obviously, the medical company was doing shipments and the toy company was doing orders. And that's why you were seeing those problems. But our customers, it is a mix. It would probably be, just from my experience, most people do use orders or sales as their data. And as I said, a lot of people in the last year or so have been switching to date to promise because they have orders coming in that are too large. This is causing back orders. They don't see that in their data. And so one way to deal with it is to switch the dates to date to promise to try to get true demand going forward because of that. Okay, so excellent point. I know I kind of use those terms interchangeably, but obviously shipments and orders are two completely different things. And the problems and the spikes you will see at those are completely different depending upon which you are using. So excellent question, good clarification. So thank you for that.
Right, this next one is a little bit of a two-parter. The first part is, how can I handle adding these events if I have 3,000 articles to mark? Is there an export or import function to edit these? And then I'll give a part B to that, which says, if I have a lot of SKUs, is there a way to make a conditional event, like if the sales were 0, then mark it as a supply issue or stock out?
Okay. Yes, you can. So to answer the question, yes, you can import these. So I've create these schedules interactively. We come over here, we open up our box, and we pick, what happened, click on a month and tell it what happened. But as you mentioned, if I'm doing this thousands of times, that's going to be very inefficient. Now, there's a couple of things that go along with it. Can we import these schedules, basically saying what happened to each of these? Yes, you can create them in like Excel and just load that in. In Excel, when you're creating these schedules, if you had your history, let's say in a different file, you could do a conditional statement that basically said, if I see a 0 in the history, which should never happen, then mark that as a stock out. You could do that, basically doing an if statement to mark that and then load all of those in all at once. So there is a possibility to do that. I'm not gonna get into the details of it, but yes, it is possible. The other thing you will notice, two things. One, in Forecast Pro, there is an outlier detection tool that looks for these spikes. And so it can create a report showing you where those all are. And you could also have Forecast Pro just try to autocorrect for them. Now that obviously won't place them in the future anywhere, but it will mark all the parts in the history. And it works pretty well. Obviously the events are cleaner because you're giving it a review, but you can use that outlier correction is also a possibility in Forecast Pro to try to handle some of these. The final thing I'll say on this is when you start doing this, what you will see most likely, or at least this is what usually happens, is that the same thing affects multiple items. Within this entire product family, these 100 SKUs all stocked out in November and December of 2021 because they were all bought by this one customer. And so I can create a single schedule and apply that interactively in Forecast Pro to all 100 of the items within this product family and just do that all at once. So usually you will see that there are common things that are happening. This entire product family had a spike here or here, and I could make one event schedule and apply it to all of them at once interactively in the tool. So you have lots of options. You can import them. You could, in your import, do an if statement in your Excel spreadsheet to look across your history to put them in that way. You can use the outlier correction for Forecast Pro to take a stab at trying to fix all of these spikes for you. There is also this kind of way of doing it in kind of batch modes interactively in the tool as well. Okay, good. I think we have time for one more question. Franklin, do you have another one there?
Sure. Oh, yes, I do. So this one says, several of our customers have said that they over-ordered during the pandemic and are still going through excess inventory. This makes our recent sales look low, but we feel like it will get back to pre-pandemic levels. How should we adjust the forecast for that?
Okay, that's a good question too. There's sort of two schools of thought on that. One is you can actually just directly overwrite, which basically says that, I think that when I look at my overrides, I come over here, I say, what, I think when I look at 2023, I think this should be 15% higher, and we should just raise it up and use our judgment to make that happen. The other thing we can do is you can force an upward trend. We can use what's called a component model. So if I came over here and did a component model, I'd be able to force a trend onto this and say, look, I actually want to start growing at, in this case, let's do 25 per month and start this kind of upward growth to start growing back up. So can you do that? Absolutely. you could either use the overrides if it really is a judgmental thing, and you could do it and say, look, I think we're going to start rising it up, or we can start forcing a trend, a growth trend onto it. The events are not perfect for a situation like this because it's kind of it's just not the right tool for that. You kind of think, hey, the last couple of months we'll event those out saying they're low. We'll put another couple of events for the next couple of months saying that's going to be low, and then we'll move it forward. It's not as clean. It's not always as easy to make that happen. So usually just an override or using some sort of upward trend onto this is a way to do it. But it's a good question. It's actually, it gets back to our excess inventory piece, not on your end, but on your customer's end. We're seeing that as I said, we were expecting that to start growing, and yes, that will cause some problems. And this is kind of a judgment call. So you would want to either force a upward trend or use the overrides directly to make that. So, okay, so I lied. We have time for one more question. I'll have one more, and then we'll wrap up for today. And again, if we don't get to your questions, please don't worry. We will touch base with you. So definitely get back in touch. Okay.
All
Last
right.
question, Franklin.
One more. There are several types of events available. So how does the system treat or act on each of them?
Okay.
Yeah. Could I better understand what different situations each one could be used?
Yeah. So the events, just FYI, like when we look at the box and it says that these different codes that we stocked out, or when I come over to this month, it says that we had a large order. These are really just labels, and they are treated independently. So a large order for this SKU number 2, would be different than a large order for SKU number 3. The same way that you have a January adjustment for every, if I have a seasonal model, every item will have a January adjustment. Some items January will be a positive month, other items January will be a negative month. It's the same with the event codes. A large order for SKU 3 might raise things by 10,000 units, where for SKU 2 it might only raise it a few hundred units. So they are independent of each other. They are simply labels. And so when it tries to calculate them, it calculates it independently. So each series, it says a large order for SKU 2, this is what it means. A large order for SKU 3, this is what it means. Again, the best way to think about it is like the seasonal factor. If I have a seasonal model, I have a January, some items January is positive, other items January is negative, but they all have a January. The same thing is true here, that the events basically fill these in independently. Okay. All right, so we have pretty much reached the end of our time here today. So I would like to thank everybody who participated today. Really appreciate it. And everybody who sent questions, thank you for those questions. That's great. And again, if we didn't get to your question, we will be in touch. We will let you know. I'd like to thank Franklin for helping moderate this. So thank you, Franklin. And again, we will be uploading this video in the next few days. You will receive information about that. And please sign up for the next webinar as well. Hopefully we will see you there. So thank you again, everybody. Hope you have a good rest of your day, morning, afternoon, wherever you are located in the world. So take care now. Appreciate it. Bye now.